Hi, um, welcome and thanks for those of you who are back with us in our ongoing conversation, a future where racism has no place, thinking about what the museums can do in our fight against racism. This conversation emerged several months ago. Actually, we started in August. But it emerged in relationship to the global anti-racism protest and mobilization that brought into question not just the museums in how they can address questions of structural and systemic racism, but also in what they can do in fighting racism. So what they can do against racism itself. As part of that conversation, we've been at the Tropo Museum, at the National Museums of World Culture, been doing a kind of deep dive, an intellectual, practical rethinking of our own practice, one that is that contends with our own practice historically as a museum that was founded in a racial logic, but not only founded in a racial logic, but was part of disseminating a particular kind of raciology. For many of you, you know that we form part of what has been called and is continued to be called the Ethnographic or the Folkakunda Museum, now called the World Cultures Museum, a museum that emerged in big parts in the 19th century, and one that has been criticized and described as practicing a certain kind of knowledge formation, but a practice of creating what Tony Bennett has called the progressive taxonomy of man, of bolstering an idea of Europe as the center, Europe as the top of humanity, and the rest of the world as others. We have been trying for some time now to think through how to contend with this history, how to deal with it, what to do with it. In our conversation that happened just about a month ago, for example, one of the questions that we were asking of activists who have been critical of our kind of institution was whether it was important to abolish these kinds of institutions rather than thinking about the future, other futures for them. In earlier discussions, we spoke to directors and curators inside the institution. We spoke also to other activists and curators outside the institution to try and understand what we might do. And for those of you who want to know, one of the important parts of this project is not just to have it in a public domain, but that it is part of the ways in which we as an institution think about our practices of decolonization, how we structure a relationship to listening to criticism, to try to learn from that kind of criticism that emerges in many parts outside of the institution, and how we embed that into our understanding or practices in the ways that we work as an institution. This is the fourth in that conversation. And if the first three were embedded in thinking through what we as institutions are grappling with, and second, what the activists, artists, other practitioners were telling us from outside the institution, this one goes to the heart of the technique and the technology of museums. It goes to what is curation in the face of anti-racism? What is collecting in the face of a project towards abolishing racism in a future? So this is what we are going to be trying to discuss today. Now, I must tell you that we've invited a wonderful group of thinkers to think with us. This includes Ming Tiampo, it includes Paul Goodwin, it includes Antonia Alampi, and I will introduce them later. And their presentations are not supposed to be statements or solutions even, but rather a kind of deep dive, or not so deep dive, into their own practice, into what they have been seeing out there and how they have been thinking about a new form of institutionality, a new form of curation, a new form of collecting that is supposed to set an anti-racist agenda. In that sense, we want to continue, and a part of the work that we're trying to do is to create a community where we can think about this together. And this is part of that togetherness. What might it mean to create this anti-racist ecology? That is a part of the question that we ask. So what we will do today is that we will have presentations from small 10-minute presentations followed by question and answers, and then open up at the end to a dialogue. I want to open up by just reminding us that more recently, there have been a few publications that have come out that I've been trying to collect, and I'm trying to teach a class around this as well. One, for example, a recent book that came out only recently, which is called Whitewalling Art, Race, and Protest in 3 Acts by Aruna de Souza. The other, which is called Curatorial Activism Towards an Ethics of Curating. The other, and that is by Maura Riley. The other is Darby English's book, which is called To Describe a Life, where he also addressed to the questions of art and race terror in this book. Or a little earlier book that came out called Mounting Frustrations, which also addresses some of these themes and how curatorial projects and practices have been important in setting particular kinds of agendas around race and racism. Now, one of the things that struck me, and perhaps I'm incautious in thinking this, and I hope you will educate me in thinking it otherwise, is the ways in which many of these books have as their starting point or their locus of conversation, the US and what is happening in the US. And one might suggest that this is very understandable. In fact, indeed, a part of the work that we've been doing emerged from the violent taking of the life of George Floyd and what that would have led to after in terms of a global mobilization. But it might lead us to the question as to why or how the question of art, art history, art institutions, or the museum itself is complicit in a particular kind of raciology in Europe, and why is that so silent? I would be interested in trying to uncover that as part of our conversation today. So I move now to our first presenter, and we will first have the presentation from Ming Tiampo, and I'm going to try and read a little bit of her bio. She's professor of art history and co-director of the Center for Transnational Cultural Analysis at Carleton University. She's interested in transcultural models and histories that provide new structures for understanding and refiguring the global. She has published numerous papers, but more importantly, or as well importantly, is also her curatorial endeavors, which she will speak about, having worked with several of the major institutions across the world around questions of art practice. Ming is a collaborator and a thinker about these topics. And this is not an advertisement, but I met Ming within the context of a project that we are jointly a part of, which is called, with Paul Goodwin, called Worlding Public Cultures, where this is exactly part of the conversation and the questions that we are also having, thinking it through from multiple localities globally and through questions of world and worlding or thinking otherwise from different locations. So Ming, welcome, and thank you for agreeing to participate. And I now turn it over to you to begin.
Thank you, Wayne, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this conversation. It's an honor to be here, and I look forward to thinking together with all of you. So to begin with, I think it might be useful for me just to address the project that we're doing together with Paul Goodwin, to just suggest that it's really very important for us to be thinking about museums and galleries as sites of public culture and as public platforms for the articulation of memories, histories, cultures, and identities. And that we can think of these places as active sites, and that they have always been places of negotiation. And, you know, as you were saying, they were the sites for the articulation of certain ideas of European supremacy. And I think that it's important for us to remember that as these active sites of negotiation, now they are becoming a place of opportunity, in a sense, that the fact that the number of voices and perspectives are now participating in these debates is increasing is actually something that's very exciting. And it actually increases the efficacy and importance of museums and galleries in public culture. And also from a researcher's perspective, it enables a more nuanced understanding of both the history of art and of visual cultures to emerge. So I see this as a really exciting moment for museums. And I thought that maybe what I would do today in my sort of 10 minutes is just to walk you through two moments in my curatorial practice that might be able to shed some light on two different models of how I have used the museum myself as a site of public engagement and anti-racist public engagement. So I'm just going to share my screen. Oh, I got the wrong thing, I think. Are you able to see my PowerPoint here? There, okay. So this is an exhibition that I curated in 2008 with two of my graduate students, Nicole Neufeld and Caroline Vanderloo. And I wanted to talk about my practice from several perspectives. On the one hand, I have worked with small spaces like this one here, these ones here, the Carleton University Art Gallery and the Doris McCarthy Gallery at the University of Toronto. So the Carleton University Art Gallery is at the university where I teach. You know, I wanted to explore some of the possibilities that are made available by these smaller spaces that give you a more grassroots connection to communities. But then also I'll be talking a little bit later about a show that I co-curated at the Guggenheim Museum in New York, which could not be more different in the sense that it's this big behemoth of a museum. And there are absolutely negotiations that one has to engage with in order to mount an exhibition at a place like that, lots of translations, but also that the importance of doing both and the possibilities that one makes available when working on both a smaller scale, but also on a larger scale. So we can talk a little about that later in the discussion. So here, this is an exhibition called Imagination, New Cultural Topographies. And as I said, it is an exhibition that was staged in 2008 and 2009, which was 20 years after the ratification of the Multiculturalism Act in Canada, and was around the time of what was called the Bouchard-Taylor Commission in Quebec, which was a conversation that took place around the question of what is a reasonable accommodation of cultural and religious practices. And so really it was a big conversation about how do societies cope with difference, how what kinds of accommodations need to be made for those differences in a Quebec Quebec context. So, you know, what you have to understand is that this is about cultural accommodation within a minority culture in Canada. And so, but at the same time that they in their province are a majority. So it was about negotiating these questions of majority versus minority on multiple levels. So it really brought out a lot of questions about that I think the Netherlands is dealing with right now, actually, about, you know, how does one cope with difference, essentially. The really important reason why we did this exhibition at this point was that it was sort of a moment where we felt like there had been an uptick of interest in thinking about pluralism after a very, very long period of relative silence. There was quite an active conversation in the late 80s and early 90s that sort of ended around 1995. With a kind of post-multicultural moment where, you know, multiculturalism was seen as a ghettoization, a kind of ethnic ghettoization, or a managing of difference. And so, you know, there was a moment which, you know, you also see in the United States where identity politics becomes kind of downplayed in many contexts. But then in 2008, 2009, we started talking about it again in Canada. And so this exhibition and also conference really served as a platform for reigniting some of these conversations. And I use this word platform purposefully to indicate the ways in which this was not just about staging an exhibition, but was about bringing communities together and getting people to talk about questions of pluralism again, and also, very, very importantly, to link together solidarities across communities. So to speak with our colleagues working in Indigenous studies, to speak with our colleagues working in Quebec studies as well. And so, you know, I'm showing you here this absolutely beautiful installation by Lucy Chan, an Afro-Asian artist from Nova Scotia, whose work we showed, and these are portraits that are cut and displayed with interviews that she did with the people that she was writing portraits on, drawing portraits of, and it's called Between Two Tears, Entre Deux Larmes, from 2006. And to the right of it, you see Frank Shabagaget's Small Village. He is an Anishinaabe artist. And he created this work to sort of think about the production of housing for Indigenous peoples that were based on the Indian house. That was a sort of cookie cutter architectural project that was used to create public housing for Indigenous peoples. So, you know, thinking about housing and homing in different ways. So there was Shabagaget, and also Henry Tsang's Orange County, which thought about Orange County in the United States, but also its doppelganger in Beijing, and thinking also about, you know, what does it mean to be between places? And, you know, of course, in a Canadian context, Chinese Canadians are often associated, in Vancouver at least, with the sort of very racist assumptions about monster homes, and sort of thinking about, you know, what does real estate mean? What does it mean to own land when you're a racialized person? And then how does one also negotiate the relationships as with Indigenous peoples as a racialized person? What does it mean to belong to that land? What does it mean to own that land when it's not your land? And then just this last slide here, I'm showing you is a work by Jamali Hassan, Al Jazeera, Prisoner 345. It was actually quite fun putting these slides together because I was remembered of the very small media storm that we created by putting Jamali Hassan's work on the outside of the building where the art gallery and also the journalism department at Carleton University is housed. Here you can see the neon sign that she created to look like the logo of Al Jazeera, but what it was is written in Arabic, it says, shame on you. Because it was a comment on Prisoner 345, the prisoner in Guantanamo Bay, who was an Al Jazeera journalist and who had been imprisoned there without trial. And so, we were dealing with lots of questions about, censorship, about what are the limits of belonging, and also how do we co-constitute who we are as a nation. So imagination, new cultural topographies, it wasn't about thinking through just what the margins of what it meant to be a new Canadian or an immigrant. No, we were thinking very much about what does it mean to be Canadian? What is Canada now? What are the cultural topographies that we are forging together at this moment? So this is a very different exhibition from the next one I'm going to show you here, which is much more of a as a classic institutional exhibition in a sense. It was an exhibition of a historical group called the Gutai Group, who were active from 1954 to 1972 in Japan. And they had many, many international relationships with New York, Paris, Turin, Johannesburg, and also with Amsterdam, actually. And so, this was an exhibition that was making a case for Japanese art as a important player in the articulation of modernism. And, was in some ways making the case that modernism is not just a Western phenomenon, right? 2013, why do we even need to be making this case at this point in time in history? And yet it was something that was still a revelation for many people. And in fact, I remember that Roberta Smith wrote in her New York Times review of this exhibition that it proved that modernism was no longer a Western phenomenon. So, hopefully it made a point at the time, but the question is, why many other exhibitions and all of the scholarly work that we had all been doing before that, had not sort of worked to do that. I'm not trying to sort of take credit here for that, but more just to think about like what were the methodologies of that we enacted in order to shift those narratives. And I'm just going to spend a few minutes talking you through what they were. They're really about rethinking the epistemologies of modernism itself, and not accepting the temporalities or the chronologies, and not accepting the nomenclatures of modernist structures that were defined by European art, but actually trying to make very subtle shifts so that the center of gravity and the articulation of agency was located in the Gutai group. And so what we did was this. So you'll see here at the top, it says early Gutai, middle Gutai, late Gutai. So this is the way that the group used to be periodized based on the moments when the Gutai group were discovered by the French critic Michel Tapier, and I say that with, in scare quotes, and also in 1965 when they participated in the Nul exhibition in Amsterdam at the Stedelijk Museum, and also when they were published, well, it was 1966 actually, when they were published in Alan Caprow's Assemblages, Environments and Happenings. So these two sort of moments of contact with the West that were narrated in many texts as the moments when the group had been discovered by the West. And so what we did was we turned it around a little bit and we changed the periodization and we made it into phase 1 and phase 2 Gutai. And the sort of hinge moment that we chose was 1962 when the Gutai group themselves established the Gutai Pinakotheka, which served as a kind of embassy to the world. That's where they showed that had their exhibitions and also where they accepted, where they welcomed visitors from abroad. The other thing that we did was that we changed the nomenclature of categories. So just very quickly, because I don't want to take too much time, in naming our categories for this exhibition, we did not use any categories that were clearly Western movements. And what we did instead was we chose words, terminologies that we drew from the Gutai group's writings themselves. So rather than relational aesthetics, we called it play. Rather than conceptual art, we called it concept. Rather than networking or mail art, we called it network. Gestural abstraction became the concrete, performance art became performance painting, and installation became environment. And I'm just going to show you one last slide before I go to show you why this is important. Oh, maybe I will not. Oh dear. Hang on. Can you see this now? I think so, yeah. All right, so this is why it's important. So this is the Tate Artist Timeline from 2012. And you can see that they were trying to make things global here, right? They were including Onkawara, Yayoi Kusama, the Gutai group between 1970, in the sort of expanded idea of modernism. But what you need to remember is that Onkawara and Yayoi Kusama were active in the 50s, as was the Gutai group. What are they doing here between 1970 and 1980? And what they're doing here is that they're following the structures that were established by British and European art. So conceptual art, you have, you know, Hans Hacke, Lawrence Weiner, art and language, Bruce Nauman. Performance art, you have anchored by Gilbert and George, right? That's your moment, Laurie Anderson. And so what they become is they become supplements to these European epistemologies. And so, you know, I think what I'd like to do in terms of making some kind of plea for the ways in which we think about the so-called global or how we display works is to think about not just, you know, inclusion, which was for a very long time the big sort of fight in the art world. But what we really need to be thinking about is how are we displaying artwork by artists from the non-West, from Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. How are we, what kinds of narratives are we writing? Who are we serving with those narratives? And why? Right? So, but most importantly, I think in this moment of political polarization and populist nationalisms, I think the important thing is for us to think about how can museums act as active agents of reimagining futures? How can museums function as places of healing by addressing racism through decolonization, dialogue, and redress? So, you know, how can we confront our difficult pasts in order to build better futures that are activated by multiple voices? Thank you.
Yes, Ming. Thank you. I think I should be able to no, I can't yet. Yes, my
Do you
camera.
want to unmute me or
No,
your camera?
no, you're fine. You can stay on, but I'm trying to camera myself, but that's not working so easily yet. So actually what we wanted to go into right now is just to open the possibility for a set of questions from any question from the public. And I'm just watching my own screen to see if there are any questions. Amal, and by the way, I just need to thank, there is something backstage is going on, a whole heap of work now from Amal Alhaag, Juliet Hagen, and Alessandra Benedict Coca, and they have made this all possible. So the question that is back there is that, are there questions that we could ask now? Come with them now so that we can talk through this. Questions? Question for Ming. It's this person says, this is Monica. Regarding the first exhibition, how did you go about choosing which works were included in the exhibition? Dealing with such a multicultural and multidimensional country as Canada, what it means to be Canadian, there are inevitably voices and perspectives that cannot be represented. And I wonder how you deal with that in an exhibition. and the person thanks you for the presentation. And so I think that in that question, Ming, is also a question of what it might mean to think this question of the multicultural, that, to be honest with you, in many parts of Europe, we've proclaimed that dead. So what does it mean to address this question? And how do you choose that multicultural? What politics do you use to make that choice? I think that's what Monica is asking.
Well, we also disavow the term multiculturalism while still being very committed to its being committed to principles of pluralism and solidarity. So, you know, in Canada, multiculturalism, it was a policy that was designed to, in many ways, manage difference. And that includes the Francophone presence and also the indigenous peoples. And so it's a sort of divide and conquer strategy, right? That, you know, you put each group into their categories, and then you know, everybody gets their quota, and so everybody's fighting each other for their quota. And so, you know, for obvious reasons, it became something that was very problematic. But what we were trying to do was we were trying to think through different ways of building solidarities across these different identity categories. And for the exhibition itself, even though it was an exhibition that was thinking through pluralism, it wasn't really about, you know, trying to choose one person from each community. We did a whole bunch of studio visits across Canada. And we did actually what my colleague and friend of mine is now doing for the British Art Show, Hamad Nasser. He's done these wonderful studio visits all across the UK, and he's putting together the British Art Show, which is going to perhaps, I don't know, it hasn't happened yet, so, but perhaps without proclaiming that this is an exhibition about multiculturalism or pluralism, but really that it's an exhibition about Britain in his case, and ours was an exhibition about Canada, saying these are some of the really interesting artists that we found in Canada at this time. And it was a very sort of racially inclusive picture of what Canada was. So we missed out some groups, but it wasn't really about the groups, it was about the artists.
I want to, I mean, there are a few other questions, but there's one thing that I want to bring to the fore here, and that is the question of land, because you mentioned the question of land and land distribution, and that, and so one could also suggest that there is a contestation between, and you said it nicely, what does it mean to own land when one is a racialized group, right? And I know that from a lot of indigenous scholars, indigenous thinkers, also around decolonization, the question of land ownership, including the article by Eve Tuck and Yang, is about the question of land and who owns it and who owns property. So my question to you in this sense then is, how do you deal with this relationship to land in curatorial practice, or into a certain kind of possessiveness and what that might mean? Because I know that whenever I'm in Canada, we start a conference by announcing where we are, you know, we are on the land of. But many people also think that we announce it, but then we continue to racialize and continue to do the racist practice of excluding indigenous people from land itself. How do you negotiate that political domain through curatorial work, where actual dispossession is always a narrative around the question? Or is that a conversation for you within your own work?
Of course, it's a very important question. And I should say that I did not start with a land acknowledgement because I'm not currently in Canada. I'm in Italy right now, so there we go. And I think that it's important for us to listen. We had a wonderful event during our first Academy in Ottawa at the exhibition of my friend and colleague Ginny Yu, where she and a group of people were talking very much about these questions of land and belonging and being a guest. So, you know, what does it mean to be a guest on land? And when I said land ownership, I didn't mean literally owning the land that, you know, like a house. I meant taking space. I meant, you know, yeah, just taking space. And what does it mean to be more than a guest, or are we just guests? In terms of trying to responsibly think through curatorial practice in this kind of a context, addressing these questions of ownership, land, I think it's really important for us to really be just in dialogue with our Indigenous colleagues, and to think about, you know, the fact that everything that we do is relational, and that we cannot be working unilaterally. So I try to collaborate as much as possible, as you know. You're muted. You're muted.
Yeah. I'll come back to this later on. Just simply because there are a lot of questions coming in, and I want to give the other presenters.
Okay.
But one of the things that I want to come back to later on, because I think there is I want to ask you to think about one of the struggles we've been having, or one of the struggles ethnographic museums have been having, where there are many contemporary artists who are okay with being at the Guggenheim, but not necessarily okay with being in the ethnographic. And that not okayness is also a question of the racedness of the ethnographic, and what might be at stake in that. So I want you to think a little bit about that, and we can come back to that at the end. Okay. I have a few artists who've troubled that with us, but we can come back to that. Thank you, Ming. Thank you also for the artists that you brought to our view. And we want to move on right now to Priya Swami. And I will not introduce Priya in too much detail, because Priya actually works in the museum, and therefore the intention here is that she also is part of the practice of listening, and not the practice of too much presentation. But Priya is the curator of globalization and South Asia in our museum, and she holds a BA in World Religions from McGill, and MA and MPhil and PhD in area studies from Leiden University. And Priya has been thinking about some of these questions primarily in relationship to our museum. So we wanted to also see how that might respond to me. Priya, the floor is yours to provoke.
Thank you very much, Wayne. And thank everyone for being here. Especially also Ming for this presentation, which I think in a lot of ways I want to build upon. There were some issues that came up. One is about the issue of sites, the other is the issue of nation, and then what Wayne had just brought up, and that is the ethnographic space versus a space like the Guggenheim, and the ethical issues that brings up. And what I thought was really powerful that Ming was talking about exhibition practices, and today I'd like to take it in the direction of collecting practices, and building up collections about anti-racism, or collections that do anti-racist work, and what that might look like specific for our museum. So I just want to comment a little bit on what's already been said, and throw in sort of my perspective, my struggle, the place where I'm working from as curator of globalization and South Asia. So I think this conversation and this, let's call it a preoccupation with the nationhood and the imagining of the nation is something that is definitely on my mind when I am working with and through our South Asia collection. Now, we've talked about what this means in terms of pluralism related to Canada. We're talking about, you know, what the European encounter with multiculturalism is. And I thought it was really interesting when being brought up, the multicultural practice is really about kind of managing difference. But in sort of post-colonial South Asia, what we are dealing with now, and what we absolutely have to grapple with, I think, in the cultural sector, is the erasure of difference, and also the potential demonizing of difference, and how we may be able to read that back into collecting practices that are steeped in ethnographic museums, and also steeped in colonial ways of organizing and logic. So when I look at my collection, the one thing that strikes me, my collection, I've taken ownership of it, the collection at the museum, one thing that strikes me is how it has been categorized and how deeply the categorization is steeped in colonial and racist logics, and how those colonial and racist logics will map themselves onto contemporary imaginations of nationhood and who belongs. So who are the sons and daughters of the soil? What does their material culture look like? What is valuable to collect? I thought also what was really interesting in the question that was brought up, you know, the issue of you will never be able to represent every group, every community that has a stake in nationhood, right? So what is Canadianness? And that's one thing I think that I try to push when I'm thinking about exhibition and display practices around South Asia. So much of what exists in collections perpetuates a monolithic narrative, and I try my hardest to think by myself and with others about what is not in our collection, what's not represented, and what can't people recognize, and try to work from that kind of perspective. I think what's also really interesting is this issue of site and site specificity. And actually, when Paul joins the conversation, I'm really interested to hear, you know, what the relationship is between something like the urban that he's very busy working with, and how that relates to the work that can be done. Because it's not that I think that this kind of anti-racist work cannot be done in the Ethnographic Museum, but I think before we start asking how it should be done, we need to be asking ourselves why it should be done. And we need to have, I think, an ethical perspective on that. And I have to say, within our curatorial department, which is quite big and quite brilliant and definitely very multivocal, we have had a conversation around what a collection of anti-racist objects would look like. And this was a conversation initiated by a brilliant friend and colleague, Wendelita Flores, who's the curator for colonial histories and Caribbean cultures. And we decided to think through what a collection of global anti-racism would look like. I'm going to share my screen because I want to show an image that relates to one of the, let's say, dilemmas, if I can use that word, that we came to as a curatorial department when we were discussing what this kind of collection could look like. We wanted it to be global in scale. That was one thing that was for sure. And this was, of course, in response to global anti-racist movements that were happening earlier this year. But we also wanted to make sure we were thinking about racism outside of certain frameworks that people often default to, such as movements that are happening in the US. We wanted to be able to think through what these kinds of collections, what these kinds of movements look like in different parts of the world. We also thought to prioritize collecting around North America, but also to prioritize collecting from former Dutch colonies so that we may be able to think through how anti-racism may map onto anti-colonialism and also post-colonialism. So also related to the kinds of things I mentioned earlier around the nation and the imagining of post-colonial nations. So one of the issues that came up quite early was, could we make a distinction between anti-racist objects and anti-orientalist objects? And it was really interesting because the conversation was had not at a conceptual level. No one was going to make the argument that anti-racism and anti-orientalism were not somehow entangled with each other, but it was practical. It was about how we were going to put the collection together. And this led me to sort of a private concern. Are we going to reinstate the ways of categorization that already exist in other collections that we know are problematic, that I've mentioned before, when we put together a collection around anti-racism? And is it possible to be decategorical if we're putting together a collection of anti-racist objects? You know, because the work I feel that I do around the South Asia collection is a lot of undoing of the categorizations, but that's one step. I think what we want to do and what these conversations want to push us to do is to think about not undoing work that has been done, but to do work differently, right? To think kind of, as Wayne would say, otherwise. So how can we actually do that within the constraints of our institution and our practices? The other issue I want to bring up, oh, actually, I'm going to go through this image first. This is a Yin Lan photo montage from Picturing Power, which is actually an intervention into an image that belongs to our collection. And it's image of two women, quote unquote, grooming each other. And this, I think, is a really powerful, jarring, and fabulous intervention into the kind of racist Orientalist idea they had about the beautiful Indonesian woman and the grooming practices, also related to the dehumanizing of people with their practices, showing them that they are closer to animals than they are to human beings, and the hierarchizing of people. So this was actually, for me, this was an object where we started thinking about anti-racist, anti-Orientalist, how are these two going to map onto each other in a practical sense? Do they map onto each other in a practical sense? But as I was saying, there's a second kind of issue that came up when we were talking about collecting global anti-racism, and that is activism and the relation to the material culture around activism. How can we collect these moments of activism, and how can they and should they be in our collection? Now, for me, the issue is that activism relates to immediacy. It's something that corresponds to a moment, and the material culture that belongs to those kind of activist moments really do belong in a certain context. And what happens when they come into a collection that by its very nature is there to archive? What happens to that activism? What happens to that immediacy? Have we taken away that kind of, let's say, power of that moment or power of that object? And the second, again, and this is related to, the questions of how to do things before we answer why we're doing them. So why are we collecting activism? Is it because of what Ming raised earlier, this idea of sort of inclusion, this sort of idea that we recognize there are things in our collection that are deeply steeped in colonialist and racist logics that are racist themselves. And somehow if we include these objects of anti-racism or objects related to activism, we're somehow undoing that, or it somehow makes us better. We need to think through very carefully the ethical reasons of why activism is important to collect and how, before we think about, I think, how we do it. I think, honestly, those were the comments that I wanted to make at this moment, and I would be really happy if we could open it up for discussion, maybe, and sort of see what other people think. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Priya. I mean, is that fine? You're hearing me, right?
Yes.
Thank you. I mean, in a way, I am very interested in the ways you've responded to Ming, how you've pushed it, and how you've actually asked us even a further question about this question of the category and categorization, because in a way, that was some of what we were discussing with Ming earlier, even about the category of the institution, the ethnographic versus the art, and what is at stake in that, and what might be included in the question of inclusion, and how that might be a question of racialization, and how do we categorize the works themselves within the institutional framework. Mm-hmm. Now, at the end of the day, one of the questions that I might bring back to you, and I think we'll go to Antonia first, but one of the questions I bring back to you is something that I'm generally interested in what is at stake. So when you ask the question about activism, I think there's a further at stakeness in that. So more recently, in the anti-racist mobilization, there were several museums that were busy collecting the anti-racist mobilization, and they wanted to collect placards, and they wanted to all of these things. They wanted to be there to collect. And in a way, one of the things that we were thinking internally was, what is the relationship between that acquisitive nature that nature of almost a certain kind of extractivisms that one has to be there to collect in the moment. What is the relationship between that and the need to be able to document these anti-racist mobilizations? Because one must contend with the history of all kinds of institutions, especially the mega wealthy institution that can just go in and collect and go in and take. And what is at stake with that kind of taking in a way for our kind of institutions in relationship to that practice of keeping, preserving these moments? So you don't have to answer that yet. We'll come back to that at the end. But I also want you to just think about the question that you also raised is, if one agrees that the categories are inadequate, we also recognize that categories are necessary to work with. So what is it that you're proposing in relationship to the non-category of categories in an attempt to try and think through these works? Yeah? We now call ourselves a World Cultures Museum because we want to move away from the ethnographic. But what is at stake in even the world cultures as a category of formation? Thank you. And now we're going to move to our third speaker. We had already said to Antonia that what we want from her is not a statement. What we want is a response and to share her experience with us from her own location, formerly working at Savvy, but currently the director of Sport Initiative in Berlin. And her professional practice as a curator, organizer, cultural organizer, curator, and director has been defined by working collaboratively with artists and professionals from different fields and backgrounds, and within rather small scale, social sensitive, politically engaged, and structurally vulnerable organization. And I think that it is a good framing to tie with you, Priya, because if one cannot speak the categories of marginalization, how do you address the categories of the marginalized? I'm interested in that. One of the things I learned from Antonia, I must tell you, and I've never told you that, is that being in Savvy, one learned to organize an event that was such an embodied practice, that was not only engaged with the visual, but was such a sensorially rigorous engagement that we could be in an event from 10 o'clock in the morning till 1 a.m. just learning and being together, which was, I think, a part of the practice that you embody. So thank you, Antonia, and it's over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much to Amal and Wayne for inviting me in this context, and thank you for the previous presentations, which I feel I will in different ways maybe pick up on. I think that the reflections that I wanted to share come from, let's say, an understanding of curating as curating the institution, more than let's say individual projects or programs, because this is really what I've been having the luck to be involved in the past years. As you said, I've been working for very long at Savvy, Contemporary in Berlin, which is a space that has been founded in, well, more than 10 years ago by Bonaventure Ndikung. And I think that, you know, and this is really also my sort of point of departure, is that I've never actually worked in museums. I've predominantly worked in insurgent spaces that were actually kind of trying to produce, sustain, and ongoing engagements that include programs, but are not only programs, that have at their core an anti-racist impulse. And in a way, in that sense, anti-racism has never been a subject of a program, but actually a sustained engagement, a practice in everything we do. And I do mention this because some of the things that we've been also structurally trying to do was to really think, you know, how is structural injustice perpetuated in institutions of various kinds, which of course include museums, but does not include only museums. And some of the things that we've been engaging with is really trying to also unpack, first of all, what is an institution? What makes an institution? What leads to programs? What leads to what, you know, you've been saying before, certain political decisions to include or exclude certain narratives? And also what conditions are actually given or proposed to which type of people and to which type of voices and to which type of histories? And so I thought to essentially make a few points that are also in a way pragmatic / practical, because I also feel, as you mentioned before, there is abundant bibliography on the subject, and I feel what really needs to happen now is also not only listening. I was just talking to Bonaventura on the phone before. I think there's a lot of listening happening, but actually being ready to structurally change the way in which we work. And I want to start from one point, and again, sorry, to just credit, because I feel also very often in these discussions there's sort of, I mean, not in this particular, but in general, there's a lack of crediting, and the ways in which credits are not happening is also showing a certain type of, let's say, impulse to name and rename without acknowledging what has been, you know, happening already. And of course that leads me also to what you said before, Wayne, which is perhaps actually putting into question this impulse to collect and categorize in the first place. And, you know, and whether that is in itself already a very colonial construct. So one is people. Sorry, I said I was gonna mention the people that I want to credit. I mean, Bonaventura Ndigung, for example, has already been writing abundantly about, you know, anti-racism, decolonization, but also a few years ago, actually precisely in the project you were part of, which was about disothering, a list of acts of disothering that institutions could literally take into practice. And there's another list actually that recently came out that I thought was extremely beautiful and I think worth mentioning, which is Yezomi Molu on ArtNet News, who listed something like 15 points to dismantle structural injustice, which is also what we're essentially looking at. So one of the first points that we were thinking about is people. Who makes institutions, and especially who hires who under which premises? What we know is there's an extreme hierarchy of understanding knowledges, of cultures. There's a hierarchy of cultures, and there's a system of legitimacy that legitimizes certain knowledges versus other. So we were looking a lot into, of course, who are boards of the museum, like looking literally at the hierarchy of power that builds institutions in the first place. You know, who are the boards? And of course, what you notice is there's a certain homogeneity of race, of class, of gender, and that already, that redistribution of power, because the boards are incredibly powerful, is maybe one step that needs to be made. The second was, of course, who produces content, you know, and under which perspectives, because content is constantly shaped and framed under somebody's vision. What we call curators, but there's more than that. There's people in education, there's people in community work, etc. And so also there, what we noticed, for example, even talking to people that have been recently hired in institutions in Germany, for example, in this sort of so-called impulse to diversify, is that what very often people witness, even in the moments of interviews, is really that no matter where people are coming from, there's certain specific institutions that legitimize their knowledge, which means specific universities, for example, which again means that there's certain people having a certain type of class, also background, let alone, you know, coming from different cultural contexts, that have to go through certain sites that suddenly legitimize their position, and that will very much influence, you know, who will actually ultimately be hired, and again in which position, which makes huge differences into, you know, what type of people speaking what type of language. And here obviously I'm not talking about you know, whether it's you know, what exact language, but it's really a way of expressing yourself that sort of produces, again, a legitimizing factor to be hired. And so in a way there's already a huge homogenizing process happening, because you know, teams, etc., very often come from very different places, but actually are legitimized to very similar institutions and very similar universities, which again creates also a huge class divide. Another thing was about, again, what experiences actually count in the moments, you know, hirings are happening, you know, and it is only, if we look only at academic knowledge and coming from specific types of academic circuits, again, there is a huge homogeneity. This aspect of experience, which includes also working experience, is extremely important, because very often to even build a certain set of experiences, you actually need to come from a specific type of class, because very often this type of work experiences are not paid. And very often also there are no conditions given to actually be able to afford them. So again, there is a huge class divide, which again goes back to a historical structural injustice that then again creates an extreme racialization of, you know, who can sort of build the type of curriculum that will be actually accepted or even considered at all. That of course then leads to programs. People make programs and again, there is a certain way of shaping thoughts, shaping ideas that you know, will influence what programs are made and when. So also there, there's various questions at stake. One is, of course, who determines what programs can happen, under which conditions different people are actually invited to take part of those programs. And again, I can say that in the experience of Saudi contemporary, you know, that has been very often considered as the other space within the European landscape. So often we've been invited to be part of programs to sort of show a certain diversity of intentions under ridiculous conditions that were very, very different than the conditions that were offered to different type of spaces. And so also there, it's extremely important to understand what type of conditions are we actually offering to whom. And that again, I think also leads me to a certain criticism of, let's say, recent exhibitions, I would say in certain cases, even biennials, in which even though names of, you know, curators or artists or let's say contributors of sorts are relatively open and diverse and are trying to represent, as you said before, Wayne, world cultures. At the same time, what is clear is that they're offered very, very little to be actually part of this on the one hand. And so again, there's a huge difficulty in actually participating at all. And hence, again, the sort of scheme of participation varies immensely and tremendously. And then there's another aspect, which is that I think very often programs are too much predetermining formats that are relatively extremely Western, actually. So very often artistic practices that maybe were never conceived to actually be only presented in some sort of wide temples of contemplation end up having to shape and fit and suit formats that they were never meant to be, and are presented, you know, vis-a-vis practices that were directly just sought and constructed to be presented for those types of, let's say, contemplation systems. And that's where I think that also, for me, something that is extremely important in this is rethinking formats of exhibiting and of showing what engagement and participation, not just of publics, but also of really literally artists and contributors means. And that's why, again, when you mentioned the format you were part of, which is this format of the invocations, where we're really trying to create a space, a sensual space that allows for different types of positions to have the space to exist that was sort of meant for it. Like, so trying to think about not just, again, this kind of extremely contemplative spaces or listening spaces where, you know, an audience is just sitting on the floor and listening carefully to somebody sitting on stage, but like, how can that be rethought in the first place? And how, instead of predetermining formats, can formats actually follow the types of varied artistic practices that exist. So for me, thinking about mechanisms of exposure are extremely fundamental. Another one, of course, is then the publics. You know, there's so much talk about engaging different communities and why are this and this community is not represented or not included, or actually how do we reach certain communities? And also there, very often from institutions, there is a certain tendency to want to have these communities, but actually there's no interest in including these communities in the making of the institution itself. So again, and this is something that, for example, Yezomi Omolu, you know, mentions, what about having members of these communities actually in the boards? You know, how can we reshape these institutions from their structures? Because I feel that otherwise it will always kind of stay as some sort of a lip service only. And so again, it's not just about including as spectators or as temporary contributors of something, or as, you know, new types of artworks that are collected in collections, but it is about rethinking those methods altogether. And here I want to mention a very, very tiny anecdote that happened, for example, in a panel discussion that we had, that was maybe a year ago or a year and a half ago. We had a whole program at Savi that was called the Invention of Science, and it was really looking also how the scientific paradigm disqualified and delegitimized so many other forms of knowledge. And we had in that context one particular show that also curated, which was, or co-curated, which was around toxic waste trades, etc. Anyway, we had a panel with members of various environmental justice groups. And Extinction Rebellion was also part of it. And there's something that happened in that panel that really stayed with me and definitely will influence the ways in which we are thinking about this new institution that I'm currently directing, which was, you know, Extinction Rebellion was constantly, you know, said to not be diverse enough, etc. And so they were sitting there and saying, okay, how can we become more diverse? And one of the responses was, maybe it's not about you becoming more diverse. Maybe it's about recognizing that diversity, there's so many groups that are diverse already. Maybe it's about supporting those from behind. It's about not taking the front stage or the center role, but actually supporting processes that are already ongoing. As somebody said, there's nothing to be discovered here. There's processes that are already existing and they need support. So again, I come from an insurgent space, and what I've always hoped for is that museums would redistribute their power, support what is there. It's happening. It doesn't need to happen in your own space. And so for me, you know, redistribution of power is certainly at the core of it, which then perhaps leads me to one last point that I wanted to mention, which is about also engaging more within museological structures and probably, you know, art institutional structures at large. And this has for me very much to do with both anti-racism and essentially structural injustice, which is empathy and care, you know, empathy and care, not as temporary programs, just as anti-racism shouldn't be, but empathy and care as structural ways in which we work, which means also offering the condition to very different types of people with very different types of, you know, backgrounds and conditions, the possibility to actually be part of these institutions. It's about feeling and not just thinking. It's about not just theorizing, but being. It's about really trying to do something against this impulse to create stories about everything and sort of collecting and naming and categorizing, which I feel is also an impulse that of course is inevitable perhaps, but like, how do we undo it? How do we let things be by feeling also what they are before wanting to name them? Yeah, and maybe I close with this note.
All right. For those who are with us, I want to welcome Paul. I don't see him flickering yet, so I hope he's listening behind there. Unfortunately, he had to be away, but he should be joining us shortly. Antonia, you don't have to go yet though, because thank you. I mean, you know, there is a wonderful thing that the ways in which you articulate that notion of the insurgent space. And I mean, one of the things that one might ask ourselves is it even possible? And that's what we were asking in our previous conversation. Is it even possible for this bulwark of an institution to be insurgent? And what might it look like if an institution, these massive institutions, could be insurgent? Can you imagine? I've always said, I will not call names, but I've always said there's a big museum, a massive museum that sees 6 million people every year. And I've always said, can we imagine what kind of change it would make in society if that 6 million, if that institution was insurgent? That would be a hell of a contribution to make. So you bring in that question, you know, what might it mean to from an insurgent space to be able to embody the practice of anti-racism, not as a question, but as a fact in what you're doing. And what you've done, and also, which is nice, and thank you for that, you've also destabilized my own question around the ways in which a lot of writing comes from the US to pull out the work that you've been doing, but also Bonaventure has been doing to try and ask a set of questions. What I really like about your presentation, and which we can discuss, is the ways in which anti-racism is so ensnared in an understanding of the structural ways in which the institution excludes, violates, continue to push its own agenda in relationship to those with whom it suggests it wants to include. I want to ask you, just before Paul comes in, and you might just want to respond to this quickly, a rather stupid question. In a way, you know, our first presenter, Lonnie Bunn, said some time ago that the role of museums in the present is to train the future activists, the future anti-racists. I want to ask you that in your experience, are there constraints? What is the big difference between a space such as Savvy? Is there a difference between the smaller spaces that emerged in this insurgents practice and older spaces that are elephants that are just stuck in a history of violation? Can you think through?
I mean, yeah, I mean, for sure. First of all, their structure and their infrastructure, you know, I feel they're already coming, you know, by building themselves out of a necessity that is not, I mean, there's no fight within, in a certain sense, you know, right? Like, and this is also why when I think about museums, I'm thinking, okay, there needs to be a structural rethinking. I mean, there is otherwise too much of a clash between what is, you know, very often said on programs and how museums actually functions by themselves. Like how can even a relationship of trust be actually built? And of course I'm generalizing, right? And I'm not talking about your museum in particular. I also don't know enough about it.
That's all right.
I'm generalizing, but there's a hypocrisy very often, and this is not just ethnographic museums, obviously, and what I'm also much more familiar with is actually contemporary art museums. There is a complete hypocrisy and kind of incoherence and contradiction between the way in which the museum functions, you know, even just what salaries are offered to whom. Who's a full paid employee and who's just, you know, a passing curator. And very often when you look at those structures, you perfectly see what is going on. And again, how can you build a relationship of trust actually when the institutions themselves are actually not able to embody what they're preaching?
Right, yeah.
And, yeah.
Let me see, Paul. I mean, I think that is one of the.
I'm here.
All right, brilliant. Antonia, that is one of the things that we've been struggling with. So it is okay in terms of that certain kind of criticality to try and think through what that is. And actually, one of the questions we've been asking ourselves is what does a careful institution look like, and a caring institution, and what is an ethics of care that could structure the institution differently than we've come to know, and how is that, you know, that care can be more fundamentally implicated in the institution as a whole. All right, we now have Paul Goodwin. And Paul, we've spoken about you too often. Your name has been called often already. So I don't know if you
don't need a big bio introduction.
No, I don't need a big bio introduction, but I want to say that Paul Goodwin is a curator, researcher, urbanist, and educator based in London. His multidisciplinary research and curatorial practices revolves around exploring creative potential of both cities and artistic production as sites of aesthetic, sociocultural, and political intervention. Paul, as we've said, sits in another project with us, which thinks through similar questions within the concept, also critiquing the concept of worlding and what that might mean. Paul, go ahead, and then we can bring in the conversation after, yeah?
Okay, thank you, Wayne and Amal and everyone for inviting me to speak to you. And also to be in such great company, some curators and thinkers that I admire greatly. What I'll do, I think, is just make a few very, very short comments, because I haven't prepared, you know, a shining presentation like some of the presentations you've had so far. It's really off my head. A few comments, and I've got some images that maybe I can share later that might illustrate some of what we're talking about. But I think it does, what I've got to say, I think does build on some of my colleagues' presentations already. In particular, I think the spirit and political thrust and ethical thrust of Antonia's project about insurgent spaces is something that really is in my mind when thinking about this, when thinking about anti-racist curating, or even the very possibility of anti-racist curating, you know, in the white cube, which in my opinion is almost structurally impossible. But anyway, that's my provocation. So in a way, this is a slight provocation, which is to kind of like be skeptical of the project or the question in itself. So I start with saying that I would say that everything I've done so far around curatorial exhibitions and research has really been, I would consider it to be contributing, or at least attempting to contribute to anti-racism, in the sense that the thrust of my curatorial projects have really all been informed by a desire to challenge and negate racist thinking and practices in art. In that sense, I suppose that the work that I've been doing and many of my colleagues in the UK and internationally, and of course, I'm a huge fan of, and I consider myself a friend and part of the family in some ways of Clary Contemporary, and I've followed that project that since the early days when Bonaventure had this, you know, small space in Berlin, and I actually met Bonaventure at a conference, and he invited me to his space, and I thought, you know, what is this? That sense of an insurgent space. I mean, so I think there's many people that have been doing this work, and I think we can say that these kinds of colleagues and friends have been engaged in what we might call the use of culture in the fight against racism. So I do think there is a cultural struggle against racism. I think cultural production, exhibitions, and art can play and has played a very important part of that. Having said that, having got that out of the way, I want to say that today I actually want to put together a quite skeptical position in regards to the possibility and effectiveness of what might be called anti-racist curating, or even the idea of, is it possible to curate anti-racism? I mean, these are terms that I think we can probably unpack in this discussion. I think this is largely due, as again, Antonia pointed out very eloquently in her presentation, this is my skepticism is largely fueled in a way by thinking about the institutional contexts in which a lot of curating, including my own, takes place, right? Institutional contexts which are largely, as Wayne has pointed out in his introduction, infused with colonial and racist logics, structures, histories, and operational models. And I would also call into question as well the way that the figure of the curator, has evolved over the past couple of decades to occupy a central and quite, in some respects, quite problematic figure in the neoliberal global workings of the art world and art market. So the way that the curator and curatorial agency, which, as I've said, in the cases of many of the people that I know and work with, and many of the people in this call today, absolutely are doing positive work. But generally speaking, I think the figure of the curator needs to be called into question in terms of the way that the figure of the curator has been very complicit in some respects with some of the trends around the globalization of the art world and the neoliberal kind of framing of that. And of course, I know that many of the friends and colleagues, especially coming from backgrounds and communities that fought against racism. So many of us have come from communities that are involved actively and have been involved actively in the struggle against racism. And of course, many of my colleagues have made magnificent contributions to the fight against racism in their exhibitions and wider curatorial work. I think there's no question about that. But yet I still remain skeptical about what an anti-racism in the racist white cube can really be. That's the question that I really wanted to, the skeptical framing, I think, of what I want to say. I think for me, the best or most effective, if you like, form of anti-racist curating, if we can call it that, is a collective endeavor. For me, and that's the key point. Rather than the focus on the individual model of the curator, I think the most important collective practices most important initiatives that have challenged racism in the white cube and outside the white cube. Many of them have been, have often involved organic relationships outside the cube with activists, community groups, and the wider public. Not necessarily always conceived in the minds of individual brilliant curators, right? And I think in many of the projects that I find interesting, the roles of artist and curator becomes blurred and overlap. And in many of the most important curatorial projects around anti-racism for me have come from artists and art practice. And in particular, I would point to the role of artists and curators in the Black British art movement in the 1980s and 1990s in Britain, what we call the Black British art movement. And I'm going to talk about a few of those examples in a minute, but I think as well, there are examples of this kind of collective curating happening today in the UK and of course across Europe, such as a group called Collective Creativity, Black Blossoms. There are a flowering of Black feminist curatorial collectives that are springing up and doing really important anti-racist work and radical work. So I think that's really important to mention. Just in terms of the Black British perspective and looking at their work in the 1980s, I'll just probably, well, I'll share some images in a second. I would say that the work of the Black Art Group, or the BLK Black Art Group from in the 1980s, 82 roughly to 84, who exhibited in exhibitions such as the Pan-African Connection that toured from Nottingham, Trent Polytechnic in Nottingham to Bristol to the Africa Centre in London, formed of artists and curators such as Eddie Chambers, Marlene Smith, Donald Rodney, Wanda Leslie, and Claudette Johnson. For me, these kinds of projects these were young people straight out of art school who were faced at a time, you can imagine, in the early 80s when Thatcherism was, I guess, akin to what Trump is doing, right? There's this very racist formation where Black youth in particular, the bodies of Black youth in particular were being constructed as the problems to society. And the question of mugging, as Stuart Hall has written about at the time, was seen as being, you know, that Black people were basically attacking people and contributing nothing to society. And of course, there was a complete exclusion of Black artists at that time from art galleries. So how did Black artists respond? They responded by doing their own exhibitions and curating exhibitions in places such as the Africa Centre, or the Black Art Gallery was a gallery that was set up in Finsbury Park in London, run by an activist, a community activist called Shaka Dedi, where many of the most important Black artists in the UK who now are household names, such as Sonia Boyce and others, many of them had their first exhibitions in these spaces outside of the museums, outside of the white cubes, and that were based on various forms of activism. I think is really important. So I just wanted to put that point. I'll show some images in a second. The second main point I wanted to talk about really is the curatorial work of Rasheed Arain, who I'm sure is known to many of you as a fantastic and important artist. But I would point to his curatorial work, and again, his curatorial work, particularly in the 70s and 80s, I think very much merged with his work as activism, setting up Black Phoenix, a radical organization that led to the text and other forms of activism. And the way that he engaged with institutions, to me, is really exemplary. So I did some work as part of the Black Artists in Modernism project, which was at University of the Arts. I did some work on Rasheed's exhibition, The Other Story, in 1989. And what many people perhaps don't realize is that exhibition, The Other Story, which was the first major exhibition in the major gallery, the Hayward Gallery in London, this was before Magiciens de la Terre. It was an exhibition that had a global scope, about looking at African and Asian artists that had been excluded from narratives of modernism. And this exhibition, he proposed it initially to the Hayward Gallery in 1978, 11 years before the exhibition took place. And in that time, in that kind of circle of refusal. He was refused by these, they couldn't really understand what he was talking about, the idea that black people could make, you know, excellent art. They rejected him, but he spent all that time challenging activism, writing the famous Black Manifesto, setting up Black Phoenix, which is an activist group, doing incredible performance such as Packy Bastard at ICA in the late 70s, early 80s. And the work that he did before even the exhibition opened in '89, for me is really important. And I actually did some research on the correspondence that Rasheed undertook with the curators of the Hayward Gallery. And it's quite interesting to study that correspondence. And much of that work is actually that correspondence. The letters are in Rasheed's book, Making Myself Visible, but some of it's in there. Also, some of it's on the Asia Art Archive website. So you can actually look at some of the letters and the correspondences. And what I found interesting is that the responses of the directors of the Hayward Gallery and Rasheed's reaction, for me, are quite interesting to understand how anti-racist curatorial activism works. So, for example, the reactions and institutions of the Hayward, for example, in each case were always defensive, right? Often accused Rasheed of politicizing the issue, you're politicizing the issue, while ignoring the political implications of their own actions. And there were often accusations of personal attack being made by Rasheed. There was also strategies of delay. In each case, there were huge delays in replying to Rasheed's letter. So they get a letter from Rasheed saying, why are you not addressing this exhibition? Then they would wait deliberately 6 months to reply, thinking that he would go away. But Rasheed, of course, would just go back and start again. And he documented all of this. And I think what was revealed in the correspondences that I researched are often well-meaning liberal administrators, always with good intentions, believing believing that they're being progressive, or even by considering Rasheed's proposals. But when the sloppiness or downright racist logic of their thinking is pointed out in a rigorous way by Rasheed, which he often did, the response was always prevarication, delay, and denial. In some respects, stemming from the kind of historical vision distortion identified by Fanon in a colonial context, due to their even inability to actually see or read the works of art by Black artists in any other way, other than through a lens of ethnicity or social relations. And what he was proposing as artworks were much more complex, and they couldn't understand that complexity, so they often resorted to racism. Now, before the exhibition, The Other Story in 89, he also curated the Essential Black Art at the Chisenhale Gallery in 88. And this point, let me just quickly, if you don't mind, share my screen. And hopefully you can see that.
Only 1 minute more.
Okay, no problem, Wayne. Yeah. I'll just to show you a few images. Can you see that? So this is the catalogue cover to that exhibition. It's a work by Mona Hatoum. So again, Black art at that time, this exhibition was about talking about the definition of Black art. And for him, Black art was not art made by Black people in the ethnic sense, but politically forged art, where people like Mona Hatoum and other Alan D'Souza and other artists, Asian and other backgrounds, could also be part of that discourse. Let me just quickly go through. So this is just some work from Thin Black Lines, which is the exhibition I curated of Lubaina Himid, which documented the work of Black women artists and the exhibitions that Lubaina curated in the 1980s. This is at Tate Britain in 2011. This is Maud Salter's work. And these are artists that have often been forgotten from the Pantheon. And you can see some legends there, Marlene Smith and Keith Piper in front of Shtepa Biswaz's classic Housewives with Steak Knives. All these works, of course, were ignored by institutions. And that exhibition in 2011 was the first time that Tate had actually engaged with the work of Black women artists. Just quickly, you can see here the Black Art Group I mentioned, an image of Eddie Chambers. This is Keith Piper's notebook, and behind Eddie Chambers is a work he made as a student that's now in the Tate collection, The Destruction of the National Front. So again, the line between, Eddie, of course, was an artist and also a writer, did a PhD at Goldsmiths, and is now a professor. His trajectory, I think, is very important in there. This is the Pan-African collection. You can see the kind of imagery here of the energy is absolutely infused with anti-racism. The other thing, what point I'd make out here as a mural project is that there was a kind of municipal, in talking about the urban context, there was a kind of municipal radicalism within, for example, the GLA, the Greater London Authority, that often supported these projects. So there's a kind of conjunctural coming together of a number of anti-racist forces that I think produced some really interesting work. And of course, there were film organizations as the Black All Day Film Collective, who I think were really important. So I'll just end there. And just to say that I think, of course, there's super important work. Now, how do I get out of this? Can you still see my screen, or what can you see?
Yeah, yeah, you're out now. That's fine.
Okay. So yeah, just to finish there, I just think I think I am quite skeptical about the idea of anti-racist curating, but I do think that to the extent that that does exist, it comes out of insurgent work, as Antonia said, and collective work. And I think we can look at those archives that I showed, but also I think there are institutions and groups and collectives that are doing that work today. I'll stop there. Thanks, Wayne.
Right. No, thanks a lot, Paul. And if everybody can put on their mics and their images now, then we can enter into a conversation and answer some of the questions from the public. I mean, there is, you know, a certain kind of critical questions around the question of what is anti-racist curation, but the question of insurgent work is something that is shared. There is something that happened with almost all of the presentation, definitely with Ming, Paul, and Antonia, which is about practices of togetherness and what that might mean to create other kinds of more equitable, just, sustainable futures. So that came up as well. But there is also something that I think that Antonia brought out in a certain kind of starkness, which I think is fundamental. And I want to start out with this, Antonia, primarily because if anything else that the ethnographic museum is confounded within its coloniality in the present is the question of restitution. And if it's anything else that is at stake in the question of restitution is a question of redistribution. So your plea for the notion of redistribution and what it might mean for cultural institutions to, you suggested it, to take a backseat, to support, to think about not necessarily only about their own inclusiveness, but what it might mean to support existing structures out there. I want to ask you a little bit. I mean, that point is clear, but I want to ask you a little bit about what do you think is at stake in that kind of supporting small other initiatives, those initiatives outside, without maximizing the goodness of the institution? Because there is something about the institution that does it because it helps them. So how do you think that works in a way?
I mean, thank you for the question and the mention. I guess what I was trying to say in a sense is also how everything is entangled, right? And what the institution is, who makes the institution, how the funding is distributed, you know, who is involved under which conditions is all very much entangled to power and redistribution of power. And so I feel that, to go into practical aspects. First of all, I do think that it needs sustained engagement. I mean, I really have it, and I'm on this, with Paul, I have a very strong skepticism about very short-term, temporary interest, and this is why I stress the fact that anti-racism, as much as work against structural injustice, is not just the subject of a program. And this is, however, how very often, and we've seen also in the aftermath of, the insurgency of Black Lives Matter in the past year, so many, extremely colonial institutions just started, posting whatever Black pictures on their, images of Black squares on their Instagram accounts. I mean, and of course I'm making like a very extreme example, but I think sustained engagement in the aspect is fundamental. meaning that rethinking the structure, meaning rethinking what experiences of people actually matter in who makes the institution itself, I think already by default will lead to commit and engage with different communities in different ways. Then how to take a step back, I really frankly think it is about trying to support projects, artistic practices, collection, artifacts, and their existence and their flourishing outside of the confines of the institution itself, which is the museum, which is the location. You know, how can we actually promote programs elsewhere? You know, like how can we care not just about our sort of national boundary, city boundary, or, you know, the walls of our own institution, by thinking where is it more meaningful for certain things to actually exist, and how do we not let them die in storages? I mean, let's also look at what very often the act of collecting implies. You know, how can we care for the life of objects, for the meaningfulness of artifacts, and not just about ownership? On that end, also, I kind of very uneloquently mentioned the issue also of naming and crediting. For example, also there, like, I feel there's a constant impulse to, for example, commission new text and rename and find new theories that have, you know, that very often share exactly the same actual references, very often without giving any real space to those references. Like, how many texts have never been translated? They are so meaningful in many different languages. There should not just be the colonial languages, for example. So, I mean, I guess I'm talking about different levels, but these are all things that I'm very much thinking about in the making of a new institution, in a sense, which is also really like, can we think about meaningfulness against impulse of collecting, of naming, of categorizing? And that for me also will lead to new forms of exposure, of exhibiting, which is not, again, just, you know, finding new display formats, but actually thinking, is the display and the form of contemplation when visiting a museum that very often displays actually inevitably are, can we think of different forms? Can we think of usefulness? Can we think of living, touching, existing with things, and not just, you know, presenting them? And that's where I also think of methods of presentations as much as where should actually things be presented when, you know, can objects, you know, even in the case of Amsterdam, like, be shown in other places? You know, there's so many people that will never enter that museum also. And, you know, how can we also rethink about where things exist and where does it make sense for them? Even when we think about communication strategies, where does it actually matter to communicate what? You know, is it only the, sorry, I could go on, right?
No, but that's beautiful. I mean, there is an importance in this, actually, and it is about also the decentralization of yourself. In our previous conversation, somebody says, why do you always need to put out a press release when you've done something? Because the press release is always about yourself and not about about the work that needs to be done.
Maybe it's a communication campaign somewhere else.
Yeah, exactly, right.
You know, like, it's not,
All right, I want to go to Ming now, because there is I want to go to Ming by asking her. There was a question that came in. It was a question about the recent practice about calling out institutions, the current mobilization of calling out museums and their fostering of racism and other practices of oppression. What changes do you think these actions that are taking place across the country in Canada can do? And what kind of activism do you think is needed to address the overwhelming whiteness of institutions in Canada themselves? That question was in it for Ming. Ming?
Okay. I should start my answer by saying first that I actually haven't been living in Canada for the past 2 years. So I'm not really as sort of connected with exactly what's happening right now. So I apologize if, you know, I leave things out, or if my answer isn't completely adequate. Hopefully, perhaps there would, I noticed that Alice Jim is on our list of participants here. Maybe she could write some answers in as well. Basically, I think that museums need to hire more people of color. It's just that simple. I mean, in Canada, museum staff, as in every other museum in North America and Europe, is overwhelmingly white. And, you know, the boards are white, and even if we're engaging in, I shouldn't even say we're, because I don't work for a museum, if museums are engaging in practices of trying to globalize, and they ask people like me to come in as consultants or guest curators or you know, advisors, if the sort of long-term DNA of the museum, if the people who work there, who make up the institution, are not, are from sort of one specific group of people, then, you know, it's just, it's not going to really make meaningful change. So I think it's really just, it's a very simple solution, honestly. And I think that's what needs to happen.
All right. There is a, just to say, I mean, that is exactly a question that is happening in the Netherlands as well. And it actually ties very close to what Antonia is saying. And one of my co-conspirators in this organization is saying that similar issues which you describe, both Antonia and Ming, are exactly what are at stake in the Netherlands. It is the same issues that we're struggling with. A next question comes that is for Priya. And it's kind of for me as well, but I don't want to do it. So it is really for Priya, and I want to ask it to Ming as well, because it is a question around the concept of decategorization. And let me see if I can find that question. Oh, yay. Yes. Is decategorization a correction to the colonial lens? And does it create space to reflect on these methods of curating and archiving? How do institutions do this transparently and with full accountability? And I will push that to ask, in the decategorization of whether or not it is the categories of formation that are racialized, or even the categories of art and the institution, what then? Do we fall into traps of new categories of formation? What then? So, and Ming, I asked you this because I was interested in your thinking as well about the category of the ethnographic museum and the category of the art museum as spaces where certain artists are included or not included. And Priya, you probably go first because you were the one who brought this up. Sorry.
No, it's fine. I will take it up because it is intensely complicated, and it's something that I'm you know, constantly thinking through. Because as you raised, you know, what about the usefulness of certain categories, right? And how then do we organize ourselves if we think that some organization is necessary? I wouldn't necessarily see decategorization as I think it was correcting the colonial lens, but let's move away from that colonial lens. Like, for example, you know, part of my job title is I'm curator of globalization. And what I see that as is actually a problematization of the notion of authenticity that exists in ethnographic museums and the way that they categorize. A lot of my work is with South Asian diaspora communities, for example, and I'm continually surprised how little attention has been paid to collecting, exhibiting, working with communities from diasporic backgrounds. And I'm speaking specifically in the Netherlands because I imagine it's very different in a Canadian case, it's very different in a British case, very different in a German case, but there's very little attention paid to this because there is, I think, an operating colonial logic about if you want material culture, if you want narratives from a certain place, you go to a place of origin, right? There is an idea of originary spaces on top of, you know, spaces that are hierarchized as being the places that produce culture, right? And India has always been a place that was considered worthy of collecting material culture. Of course, a certain way of collecting, a certain type of collecting material culture. And what happens outside in migrant communities is considered a bastardization, or it's considered something inauthentic. And so what I'm interested in doing, and I'm working with a lot of colleagues in the museum right now, I'm working with friends and artists in the community here in the Netherlands to sort of work through that problematization, to draw attention to it, to draw attention to why that silence exists, and then put emphasis somewhere else. right? So always moving outside. And I think that's the kind of concrete work that I hope to do with de-valorization. That's what I think is also possible in this moment. But then again, it also needs a lot more, let's say, thinking through as well.
Right, quick, Ming, you want to respond quickly and then have a question? Yeah.
Sure. So, I mean, for me, I think it's important to say that categorizations are are ways of knowing, right? They're epistemologies, and that if you bring new epistemologies to the table, new ways of knowing, new ways of categorizing, then you're necessarily going to be able to shift the ways in which objects and cultures are understood. In terms of the question of museums of ethnography versus art museums, I think that on one level, artists who say that they're happy to be at the Guggenheim but not happy to be at an ethnography museum are in some ways buying into the hierarchies of cultures that say that, you know, art museums are for European and North American white culture, and that they want to be accepted by that, whereas being sort of racialized in an ethnographic museum is something that, you know, they really don't want to be associated with. And I think that's a really problematic perspective that needs to be examined. But on the other hand, there's another reason why artists would refuse to be in a museum of ethnography. And this is something that as an institution you might want to think about, and I don't even know if you do this, but it's that artists think about museums, ethnographic museums, as being about cultures rather than being about artists. And so when you go, if you're showing in a museum of ethnography, you're showing as a representative of a culture, of a place, right? And you're not seen as an artist. And so if there's some way to change that perception, maybe that would help in terms of recategorizing what it is that you do.
All right. I want to ask, thank you, Ming. And I think that, to be honest with you, I think that has been the eternal struggle, right? And that's why we've been moving from the ethnography to the art, whatever. I still want to push back, because I want to suggest that the conception, and I think this is a long discussion as well, the conception of the museum, the art museum, as the space for the artist is also a space for the understanding of the museum as whiteness as artist, and in the ethnographic museum as the space for culture, as if whiteness has no culture. But that is a long discussion that we can have in another space. I want to ask Paul a question now. Paul, now I'm going through a lot of questions here. And Paul, this question might be interesting for you because it's from Yellow Bauhaus, I think it is, which is saying, I have the impression that the idea of curating antiracism often conflates or is confused with curating anti-elitism. And how can we think through that, the relationship between anti-racism and anti-elitism, and what is at stake in that process? So I think that Yella is asking in an interesting way a question that is close to you, which thinks through the relationship of class and race, and the questions of, in our own thing, racial capitalism, if one wants to call it that, by thinking through those lenses. And what is at stake in that project, I think Yella is wanting to ask.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, we're hearing you now.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I entirely understand the thrust of that question. I guess in terms of, if it's implying that anti-racism is kind of limited because it doesn't deal with class. And so it should be a kind of, it's not intersectional enough. I think that's kind of maybe what he's getting at. Is that right, Wayne? Or how would you interpret that? I'm not quite sure.
I think that,
as often with Yella's questions, like it takes me a long time to kind of get what he's really trying to say.
Is brilliant. But I think that at stake in that question is also, and I don't want to put any words in Yella's mouth, but there are some people who also think that the problems that we face is not necessarily a problem that is a race and racialization question. It is also a problem of class. So, and that one could say that there are also a few
of course, you know, I mean, we can go back to we can, as you say, we can go back to Cedric Robinson, we can go back to Pierre Bourdieu. I mean, of course, in the museum context, race and class are absolutely intertwined, right? In the way that the racial formations of various societies, Black communities, migrant communities are often in the poorest communities. And for example, in the UK, you know, it's argued that the discourse of anti-racism doesn't really talk about the way that white working class communities have been completely ignored from questions around diversity and et cetera, et cetera. But I think we shouldn't be diverted from the real question, which is about the colonial origins of these spaces that we're talking about, and that I mentioned in terms of the white cube, and the need to be very clear that these are racist structures that need to be, I don't know whether decategorization does that. I mean, Ming is right, it's an epistemological question, and we need to kind of, we need some more epistemic disobedience, absolutely, to kind of queer those categories, absolutely. But there are some really material implications of these questions that we need to address. And I think that's where the curatorial and academic discourses needs to be very much in dialogue with groups on the ground, with groups that are actually working with communities. And so co-curation, I think, and again, this collective sort of sense would be really useful in that. But I guess I don't have a direct answer to that, other than to say that, to Yella's question, other than to say that, yes, there are lots of conflations, but let's be clear, you know, we're clear on what racism is, and we're clear that we need to fight it.
All right, brilliant, Paul. I have one question, and I am going to read it. I think the question was from Taos Damani, and the question is, how can museums advance beyond this type of piecemeal, superficial outsourcing and anti-racist practices in order to full and continuing ownership of the responsibility of addressing decolonial work, change and embrace, and remain permanently and collectively embedded in the institution? I think it was asking a similar question to this question emerges in relationship to Antonia's first provocation, was about an embedded anti-racist practice in your work rather than something that is piecemeal. Is there anyone who wants to address that? How do we commit and not the piecemeal? I think Antonia has answered that question already, I must say, in many ways. But if anybody else wants to suggest anything, that would be nice. Or it was, it was Carol and Dixon who asked the question. Sorry, Carol, forgive us. Anybody else wants to say something? All right. I have about 47 questions, and those questions will never be answered today. But I want to trouble you all with a last provocation. And it is a provocation that is probably simplistic in its orientation, and I apologize for that. But it's a provocation that I see in museums as always as a distancing from the question of racialization. Because almost every one of you now have spoken to the notion of community and working with community, right? And what is at stake in that kind of community-oriented work. And I can tell you from in the institutional practice, and I'm not saying this about my own museum, but I can tell you that in my 20 years of museum work, every time you speak about that, people come back with the idea that there's no community. That's what they say to you, that you cannot address it because the community doesn't exist. There is, in anti-racist work, there is a question about what whiteness inheres, what is in it. So in a way, it is also about the ways in which we dismiss certain categories. And I can tell you that happens in diversity work as well, or decolonial work, when you say we are trying to address structural inequality and somebody comes back with, but there are many different things. How do we, oh yes, Amal just says we have 6 more minutes. How do we address this, what some would call this obfuscation of, possible obfuscation of the issue, or attend to the idea that people say communities don't exist? What do museums do to address that question in its own anti-racist practice? Sorry to ask it, so it's probably a bad question, but I felt that the need to ask it.
I actually think that this builds on what Paul just said, is that there is a sort of an academic curatorial discourse on the one hand, and there's what's actually happening, something that's a little bit more raw and more real and involved with people themselves. And if we think about these things as abstractions and we continue to institutionalize them, then we talk ourselves into these circles, and then we convince ourselves that this work can't even be done in the first place. If we talk to people who are actually affected by these kinds of races, histories, legacies, afterlives, then you get a very different idea of the kind of work that you could do and how that could be reparative. So I think it's about balancing indeed kind of scale and level, and it's about bringing it down. And Antonio brought this up as well, and I think it's really important and really brilliant, especially within the ethnographic museum context, is we are so used to seeing that space as a space of history and not as a space of affect. And that has really changed, that has really shifted the way that we kind of value the objects that we have, the stories they can tell, and the kind of affective value that they have for different kinds of people and what they bring into the space. So it's also, you know, it's about feeling in a different way and prioritizing feeling beyond or alongside, let's say, histories, provenances, these kinds of things as well. So that's, I mean, I think it's sort of a combination of things that have already been said in earlier sessions.
Antonia, yes.
I respond with a very provocative answer, which is if we would again change the types of people that inhabit institutions, we would not have to constantly respond to these very exhausting questions.
That's not
you and all the professionals and friends that keep having to explain such basics as if, you know, why does anti-racism matter? It's like mind-blowing that this is even something that still needs to be justified.
Yeah, no, but that is I mean, I could ask, does Paul or Ming want to address that, or Paul?
I would just add that, and I entirely agree with Antonia about that. But I would just add that I think in relation to museums and communities, definitely the question of duration is a really important part of that. It takes years of community liaison, going out to communities to talk to them. The problem at the moment is that, for example, in the wake of Black Lives Matter, and you get, as you say, you get these institutions that put the black square up or make the, you know, put out a press release saying we stand in solidarity with these communities when they've done no work whatsoever, which is complete bullshit. I have witnessed one or two examples, and I'm thinking about, for example, Liverpool. When I did some work at Tate Liverpool in the early 2000s, around the black Afro-modern exhibition. Yeah. We were working on that, the public program, and we worked with the education team who'd been working with local communities in Liverpool for over 10 years, and were able to establish quite interesting links with them. Now, I'm not saying it's perfect. And they, for example, they had a curatorial program called the Fifth Floor or something like that, where they had an imaginary fifth floor, which is where communities could curate exhibitions that often materialized in the galleries. There's a cook, and that was possible because Tate Liverpool was a kind of not as much hierarchical as, say, the other Tates, and many of the people in some of the teams lived in those communities, etc. So I'm not saying that it's not possible, but duration, time, and granular kind of work on the ground, if it's going to happen, has to be there. That's what I would say.
All right. Now I give Ming the floor if you want to say anything. If not, then that's fine. But just I give you the opening to do that, and then I will close off.
Well, I think that I might just take the opportunity to amplify what Antonia was saying in terms of sharing power, and what does it mean to then open up the museum to communities that are already mobilizing and groups that are already doing this work. You know, how does one build solidarities that have duration and open up the space of the museum to them and share power?
So we unfortunately Zoom, and it's not Zoom. It actually is us. I mean, we know for a fact that all of us have been on a Zoom conversation from this morning to now, which is tiring. So we can't go for longer. But this was a wonderfully fruitful discussion, and I think there is something that where we ended, a particular space which is important. I must say that in every presentation I've personally felt criticized as an institution. But that's fine, because that was the intention. The intention is for us, and to take what you suggest as a part of the criticality of how we probably can change and what we're doing and what we don't do. And even Antonia, your defense of citational economies and what is at stake in the citational ethics in all of that. But I think that most urgently, in where we ended for me, because there were so many things, is this point that if one needs to question the violence that racism does, if one is in a moment of questioning that racism is destroying the lives of certain individuals or communities, then perhaps one is exactly not doing any work. Then perhaps one is exactly just putting that black thing on the line, because to obfuscate the precarity that colonialism continue to ensnare some peoples in is exactly to continue violation. So one of the things that we're going to do next year is, early next year, is that we're having an online journal called Provocations. And in that journal, we're going to actually have a conversation which is called in defense of community. And part of that is to actually think about this. How dare us think, question the precarity that people call out to say that we live in these kinds of ways in the present. I want you to thank you all. This was a wonderfully rich discussion. We've heard about practices of togetherness, about solidarity, not necessarily in only what we can do now, but in how we can learn from that solidarity historically and what that might mean. We've learned about being skeptical about anti-racism as a curatorial practice, but thinking anti-racism as a politics of the very institution that we work in. Because perhaps if it is embedded in how we work as institution, then curatorial projects and collecting projects will just follow suit, rather than thinking that anti-racism curation is going to solve an institution that is fundamentally racist. We've heard about the paying on, the idea that actually perhaps to center ourselves in the marketing campaign, in the announcement, in we've done good work by patting ourselves on the shoulder, might not be the work that needs to be done if one is supposed to create an anti-racist ecology both inside and outside the museum, but rather we should create the possibilities for these anti-racist practices to flourish all over our societies. We've suggested that a decategorization might be important if one is to think again about how the institutions can work, but that this decategorization requires an epistemological shift, which is supposed to shift as well, and not just a symbolic shift. We've heard many things today. We probably haven't talked enough about collections, but that follows. So I want to thank you all for this conversation, and to again say that a part of our work is to make you, even if we do it badly, it make you complicit in the work that we are trying to do to fashion anti-racist futures. So thank you all. Until next time. Thank you. Thanks everybody who was a part of the conversation.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you very much.
All right.